TikTok is very optimistic that the Supreme Court is not only going to hear their case, but will also eventually rule that the TikTok ban is unconstitutional. During a TikTok briefing I was just part of a few minutes ago, the company's legal counsel discussed the game plan moving forward. Andy Pincus, who argued TikTok's case in front of the DC Appeals Court back in September, said the appeals court simply got this ruling wrong. He said the three-judge panel did not fully take TikTok's arguments into consideration and ultimately leaned too heavily on the word of the federal government. Now, as I reported last week, the Washington, D.C. Appeals Court ruled that Congress had every right to pass the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, which established the TikTok ban, and that they did not need to give anyone a reason why. The law itself says the reason why TikTok was being banned was because Congress believes that TikTok is a national security threat because of its ties to China. And he says, not so fast. He said the Supreme Court has a long history, which I've reported on here, of protecting the First Amendment rights of Americans. And if this law is allowed to stand, he said it would set a dangerous precedent of expanded powers of the federal government that could eventually stifle even more free speech if the government feels like it. He argued that under the current laws, at most, foreign propaganda, if that's how Congress wants to designate TikTok, should be labeled as foreign propaganda. Not banned, not hidden. At most, legally, it should be just labeled as foreign propaganda. And he said this new law ignored that precedent and has just taken things way too far. So now what? Well, TikTok has asked the DC Appeals Court to put a temporary pause on the TikTok ban scheduled to take effect on January 19th. That way, it gives the Supreme Court time to decide whether or not the justices want to hear this case. The government, by the way, opposes that. They want the appeals court to stick with the ruling and keep the ban in place. But regardless of what happens, Andy says TikTok is absolutely going to the Supreme Court to fight this. TikTok wants this law to be overturned. He says because of the major constitutional questions it raises, because of the incredible number of Americans who will have their free speech impacted if this ban goes into effect, and because of what he describes as this extremely overbroad new power that Congress gave itself and the executive branch to shut down free speech, he fully believes this is the type of case the Supreme Court loves to hear. And he says he ultimately believes they will side with TikTok. Now, you have to understand that is the opinion of the lawyer hired by TikTok. His job is to be optimistic. As I have reported before, the Supreme Court does not have to take this case. They are not required to take any case. And even if they do take this case, there is no way of knowing how the conservative supermajority of this court will rule. But here's the thing. We are going to know something very soon. We are anticipating a ruling from the DC Appeals Court on whether it's willing to pause the ban by next week. And once that ruling comes in, Andy says TikTok is ready to file this emergency appeal to the Supreme Court. For the record, he also said if the DC Court of Appeals decides not to grant a pause or an injunction on the ban, then TikTok is going to ask the Supreme Court to put a stop to the ban while it considers whether to take TikTok's case.